This is the year that constituted the final break between Martin Luther and the church in Rome. Last week we looked at his appeal to the German nobility, which is a rather political document. Then this week we look at the Babylonian Captivity of the Church, in which Luther addresses the papacy directly. But next week we see him on, I think, one of the classics of the Christian heritage, on the freedom of the Christian person. That's a very positive, affirmative. Here in that essay we get Luther at his very best. So then the week after that we get Luther at his very worst. His essay against the Jews. It is just terrible, 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 terrible. But we better read it in order to get a balanced picture and in order to understand the history of Europe, both before Luther and after Luther. So this morning we are going to be led in our reading and discussion of the Babylonian Captivity of the Church by Forrest Howe. One apology from me from last time. I referred to Fordham University as though it were not a Jesuit university. It is a Jesuit university, so I need to correct myself on that. Let's begin with prayer. Dear God, again, we are thankful for many, many people in the present and in the past, and surely Martin Luther is one of them. We pray that we will benefit from reading his very words and discerning how many of them are still true. Thank you also for Forrest Howe and his leadership of the Sabbath School. We will learn from him again today. Thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Good morning. Good morning. I want to tell you this has been a humbling experience going through the Babylonian captivity of the church. I thought I was pretty cognizant of a lot of the issues, but I found out that I wasn't. And I found out about accident and substance, different things like that. It's 500 years ago. And in one way, it's a very short period of time ago. There's a lot has happened in the last 500 years. And you think about 500 years before Luther, that was basically when William the Conqueror in 1066 met the Saxons at Hastings, wasn't it? Right. And then you take 500 years before that, you're back to Augustine, and then 500 years before that, you're in the time of Christ. So 500 years in the broader perspective is not a lot of time. And yet at the same time, it's a different world that Luther lived in. It was pre-scientific. People didn't live very long. People died of things that today you would just kind of slough off. If you got cut, you might die with lockjaw, gangrene. So it's a different world. It was pre-Enlightenment, where they didn't ask the scientific question. And so, in one sense, when I was reading here the Babylonian Captivity of the Church, I was wondering, what are we really talking about here? What's going on? And so when I did a little extra search in this, I realized it was such a different world. Just a little side issue, and I was telling David this morning that I read some of the etiquette of the time. People were very open about bodily functions. One of the things I learned, you were not supposed to talk to anybody on the street who was in the middle of a bodily function. Rude. And also you were not supposed to undo your clothes on your way to the bathroom. So it's a different world. And so here we go. And so I think as Adventists we understand pretty much about the issue of the Babylonian captivity. And this document came as another document was coming to Wittenberg, and that was a papal bull against Luther. And so two ships cross in the night. Just step back up. And so let's kind of remember that as we go through this. Now, the document that I've given you is selected passages. It's 65 pages long. I didn't think we had enough time to read it here this morning. So, and due to the lack of time, I didn't get to mention the exact location in the Babylonian document. But I assure you that these are taken from that. So I want to start out, I don't know, how did we do that last week? Because I wasn't here. Did you have people read it, or did you read it up front?
I read it, but I think if you want to have people read it, that'd be great.
Okay, who would like to read the first paragraph?
Will the microphone pick it up?
Yes.
Okay.
Anybody want to read the first paragraph?
I think Bernard did.
He volunteered you. Would you read the first paragraph? Now, this is about indulgences. It's not technically on the sacraments, but this is kind of the context which Luther now is writing his document.
Whether I will or not, I am compelled to become more learned day by day, since so many great masters vie with each other in urging me on and giving me practice. I wrote about indulgences 2 years ago, but now I extremely regret having published that book. At that time I was still involved in a great and superstitious respect for the tyranny of Rome, which led me to judge that indulgences were not to be totally rejected, seeing them, as I did, to be approved by so general a consent among men. And no wonder, for at that time it was I alone who was rolling this stone. Afterwards, however, with the kind aid of Sylvester and the friars, who supported indulgences so strenuously, I perceived that they were nothing but mere impostures of the flatterers of Rome, whereby to make away with the faith of God and the money of men. And I wish I could prevail upon the booksellers and persuade all who have read them to burn the whole of my writings on indulgences, and in place of all I have written about them, to adopt this proposition: indulgences are wicked devices of the flatterers of Rome.
Okay, so we're starting right out in a nice, gentle, diplomatic process, right? I was telling someone recently, Luther would never have qualified for Her Majesty's Diplomatic Corps. And we're going to see some other things. By the way, in one translation, where it says stone, it was the Sisyphean stone, which, remember, Sisyphus was to roll the stone up, and then at night it would roll back down. So I thought that was a good concept. So again, Luther had written on indulgences, and now he regretted what he said. Do you think he had modified his view for the more kinder view? Shake your head no, because he didn't. He really felt worse. And notice he says in here, whereby to make away with the faith of God and the money of men. So part of, well, the main purpose of indulgences was to raise money. And of course, you know, Pope Sylvester, was that Pope Sylvester? Or can I count on you, Peter? I can't remember which pope it was in 1517. Anyway, they were raising money for St. Peter's anyway.
I think it was Clement the Fifth.
Okay, see, and I don't question that, so thank you very much. Second paragraph. Now, actually, okay, who would read the second paragraph?
You know how specially those logicians of Leipzig employ this new kind of argument. Does not Emser also, after having professed in his former book to speak fairly about me, and after having been convicted by me of the foulest envy and of base falsehoods, confess, when about to confute me in his latter book, that both were true, and that he had written of me in both an unfair and a fair spirit? a good man indeed, as you know.
Okay, I think there's a little tongue in cheek here. Of course, Emser was one of the opponents, and the logicians. Leipzig, of course, is the part of Germany where Luther was from. By the way, my son dated a German girl for several years, and she was from Leipzig, and she grew up in her first 10 years under communist influence. And she knew all about Luther, but she didn't know anything about the Bible, which I found very interesting. So, anyway. So again, this issue of the indulgences was very critical and really a touchstone at the time here of Luther. Okay, I'd like to go on now. Now, there's supposed to be a little highlight there. Now we're going to get into the Eucharist. There were 7 sacraments. Now, we as Adventists, we have I guess we don't really use that word in this sense, but a sacrament was a way to get the benefits of Christ. It was a work. And this is one of the issues that Luther struggled with the Roman Church. Of the 7, he accepted 2. Maybe 3 lightly, but 2, the Eucharist and baptism. So at this point, in paragraph 3, we're talking now about the Eucharist. Now, one thing that you need to remember, I say one thing, several things you need to remember. One is the Eucharist was central to the Roman Church. It was the way that you gained salvation. And if you were excommunicated, that meant what? You couldn't take communion. And if you didn't take communion, then what? You didn't stand a chance. And so, and also, one of the things that Luther was pointing out here is the Roman Church was wrong in that they only gave the emblem of the bread. Would not give the cup. And he argued, and you'll see that he argues in favor of both. So, we're starting now in the Eucharist, the first sacrament. Would someone read?
I pass over the rest, that I may not quite kill you with the dregs of this most offensive drain.
Hold on just a minute, Jack. Does anyone know what the most offensive drain is? It's a cesspool. So he's using a metaphor here that's very, very clear to his readers. It's a sanitary sewer that's out in the open is what it is. So, again, he's starting out very, very polemical here. Okay, I'm
Getting
sorry.
down and dirty.
That's right, flowing along.
Lastly, he adduces Paul, 1 Corinthians 11, who says that he had received from the Lord and had delivered to the Corinthians the use of both the bread and the cup. Here again, as elsewhere, our advocate of one species handles the scriptures admirably and teaches that in the passage Paul permitted, not delivered, to use both kinds. Do you ask how he proves it? Out of his own head, as in the case of the 6th chapter of John. For it does not become this lecturer to give a reason for what he says, since he is one of those who proofs and teaches all come for their own visions.
Notice again, there's this dig going right ahead here. Oh yeah, that's a good thing. Yeah, what'd you do, pull that out of the air? You just pull that out of the air? So he's building, and we'll see later on that it gets even more intense. But again, he's criticizing the Roman Church because they only give the one emblem and not both. But why do they only give one? Because of some screwy idea in his thinking that, or the screwy idea of someone else's thinking, and Luther has no tolerance for that. Okay, the next paragraph.
I confess that I've been unable to resist this reasoning, and have neither read, heard of, nor discovered anything to be said on the other side. While the words and example of Christ stand unshaken, who says, not by way of permission, but of commandment, drink ye all of this. For if all are to drink of it, and this cannot be understood as said to the presbyters alone, then it is certainly an impious deed to debar the laity from it when they seek it, were it even an angel from heaven who did so. For what they say of its being left to the decision of the church, which kind should be administered, is said without rational ground, is alleged without authority, and is as easily condemned as proved, nor can it avail against an adversary who opposes to us the word and deed of Christ, and whose blows must therefore be returned with the word of Christ. And this we have not on our side.
Okay, next paragraph.
I am not therefore advocating the seizing by force on both kinds, as if we were of necessity commanded and compelled to receive them, but I am instructing the conscience that every man may endure the tyranny of Rome, knowing that he has been forcibly deprived of his right in the sacrament on account of his sins. This only I would have, that none should justify the tyranny of Rome, as if she had done right in denying one kind to the laity, but that we should abhor it and withhold our consent from it, though we may bear it just as if we were in bondage with the church, where we should not be at liberty to use either kind. For this reason I have said that it would be a fine thing, in my opinion, if this bondage were done away with by the decree of a general council, and Christian liberty restored to us out of the hands of the tyrant of Rome, and if to each man were left his own free choice about seeking and using it, as it is left in the case of baptism and penance. Now, however, by the same tyranny, he compels one kind to be received year by year. So extinct is the liberty granted to us by Christ, and such are the deserts of our impious ingratitude.
Don't casually go over the word Turk. The Turks represented whom? Muslim. And what had happened less than, 75 years before? Do you know? Was it 1452, 1451, Constantinople fell?
1453.
I'm off by a year.
Very close. And I'd like quickly to make a correction. I didn't understand exactly the year you were asking me.
No.
In 1517,
Oh,
the
yeah.
Pope. In 1517 was Leo X,
Okay.
the Pope. He came to the papal throne after Julius II from the La Rovere family. He's the one that demolished the St. Peter's Basilica, and Leo X, that came from the Medici family from Florence, a family of bankers, very rich. He inherited this great task to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica.
Okay. And there's a whole lot of stuff going on in the background. This was not all spiritual battle going on in Italy, was it, Peter? These were families that were at one another's throats.
Well, he bought the papers, basically.
I'm sorry?
He bought the papers.
Oh, can you buy the papacy?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure you could, yeah. And they didn't call the Pope Father for nothing, right? So, again, there's just a lot of contact going on. But the fall of Constantinople was a very critical point, because for years the Western Church, the Roman Church, was in the backwater compared to the church at Constantinople. It was a stronger church. It was more advanced. They say that when the Crusaders went to Constantinople, they were amazed that they had running water. They talked, in the street, people talked about philosophy, whereas they came from castles that were dark and dank with no plumbing. So you can imagine what it was like. But the fall of Constantinople was very critical to the West, because as the Turks came up through the Balkan Peninsula, there was a possibility that Christianity could be overridden by the Muslims. So when he compares the Pope to the Turk, this would be like accusing someone here of being like Stalin or Hitler. It's pretty strong language. Okay, the next paragraph. Barbara?
In the next place, when the priest is performing Mass publicly, let him understand that he is only receiving and giving to others the communion in the Mass. And let him beware of the offering up at the same moment of his prayers, for himself and others, lest he should seem to be presuming to offer the Mass. The priest is also who is saying a private Mass must consider himself as administering the communion to himself. A private Mass is not at all different from, nor more efficient than, the simple reception of the communion by any layman from the hand of the priest, except for the prayers. And the priest consecrates and administers it to himself. In the matter itself of the Mass and the sacrament, we are all equal, priests and laymen.
I'm going to just read that next paragraph, that little one.
Now, the sacraments are not fulfilled by being done, but by being believed. Thus, it cannot be true that there is inherent in the sacraments a power effectual to produce justification, or that they are efficacious in signs of grace.
Okay. Luther, well, first of all, the Roman Church believed in transubstantiation. And I just repeat it, just keep it on track with Luther. And that there actually was a transformation. The bread became the body of Christ and the wine became the blood. I have a hard time understanding how people can rationalize that. But if you remember that Aristotle's philosophy ruled the day. And I also am not sure that if before Thomas Aquinas that the church believed in transubstantiation. The Eastern Church does not. But once Aristotle started to rule the day philosophically, as I understand it, there's a difference between accident and substance. And I'm really starting to get into some areas that I know very little about. My son was asking me some questions one day, and just like I did to you today, I just said, if I go any further, I'm not really telling you anything that I know, I'm just making it up. But the accident of this chair is this: it's plastic, it's hard. There's other chairs around, they're plastic or whatever. It's still a chair. And so the bread, when the magic words are spoken, the accidents stay the same. It still looks like bread. Still looks like wine. But it's changed. Now, we who live in a scientific age, we really have a hard time with that. So anyway, now Luther believed that they weren't changed. That the presence of Christ was in the wafer and in the wine. But it was still bread and it was still wine. Now, I have several Lutheran friends and I've asked them about this issue. And it really, I think they don't know what to think about it anymore. And so when they have communion, they just go have communion. And they don't think about all this behind the background, in the background. And by the way, this idea in the Roman service, in hoc corpus meum, is where the word we get in magic, hocus pocus. And so, Now, in the Adventist church, when we take the bread and the cup, what do we think? Are we thinking this is Jesus' body?
Symbols.
There's
Symbols.
symbols, that's right. Symbols.
Okay, so Catholics believed in transubstantiation.
Correct?
The Luthers believed in consubstantiation.
Right.
Which means that the presence of Christ is in, with, and under the substance, but the substance itself doesn't change. But we're with Zwingli in that we think of it as only symbols. So you've got these three different points of view, and the Lutheran position is somewhere in between. But there's a famous discussion where Luther and Representative Zwingli, or was it Zwingli himself? I forgot. They had this big debate, and Luther had pulled back the tablecloth and said, "This is my body." He wrote that in with his knife and pulled it back over that, and they said, Zwingli people said, "No, it's not, it's just a symbol." And he put back, "This is my body." So he was not willing to go as far as Zwingli, making these mere symbols, but he wanted to stay away from transubstantiation. So he has a middle ground position on it.
You know, Luther, and in this document, he makes an interesting analogy, David. It talks about iron being heated with fire. And it makes the arguments like that. In other words, there's both fire and iron there. So it's an interesting concept.
But the iron remains iron.
That's correct, and the fire still remains fire. But that's how he kind of pulls that concept together. And you know, and Adventists are part of the Anabaptist movement. I say the movement historically, and so we do take this as symbols. By the way, I had the privilege at one time of standing one of Zwingli's pulpits. It was just kind of a head trip as I stood there. I just thought this was fascinating. So anyway, but notice again, this issue of the Eucharist, which is so central to the Roman Church. That's how they controlled people. I mean, you're only going to live on this earth for a short period of time, maybe 40 years, and then you're going to spend an eternity in hell unless you can get an indulgence and someone's going to get you out. So they had a lot of control. We don't live in a world like that where the church controls so much. The church is part of our overall experience, but it doesn't dominate on a day. Well, people could argue, I guess, but not in the same sense. And this is why the popes had such power. And by the way, I think this is one of the reasons that in last week's presentation about the address to the nobility of the German nation, that's why Luther started here first, because he knew that if he didn't have the authority of the nobility, he was in trouble, as was us and others who had actually had some of the same concepts that he did. But you needed power. And that's one of the sad things that I've seen or I've discovered through the years, that great theological arguments are not won by powerful ideas, but they're won by force. We saw that in the Arian Athanasius controversy in the 4th century. And it was that Athanasius actually had the stronger force there in Alexandria. So again, two things. This is not the body of Christ. This is not the blood of Christ. And you give to all the both symbols. David, do you know why they only gave the bread and not the cup? I'm going to say I didn't get a chance to look into that. Is it? Yeah.
This can't be the reason, but I want to raise a scientific question. Because if only the priests were drinking the wine, and then the Lutherans come along and they start using the common cup, are we having more disease in Lutheran churches than we had in the Catholic churches because we're spreading more germs using the common cup?
High alcohol in that cup.
Can add a little bit to that. I believe that Luther is explaining why they are doing that in the chapter. He said that basically when you read carefully, Jesus said, this is my body, one of these, I mean, this is my body, this is my blood. He doesn't say take from them all of you. He says, I think only about the body, or only about, I think only about the body. And that's the reason they're explaining that they are giving only one element to the poor people.
Yes, and again, if you go into...
And if you read the text,
yeah,
yes,
you read that
that's
whole
the way
thing.
it says.
You understand why they believe Luther, of course, he disagrees with them on that, as I remember correctly. And obviously does, because...
If I recall correctly, it's using this, I think, John 6.
Yes, John 6. Right. So anyway, I would say, though, that the alcohol probably took care of a lot of the germs. So I know that when I go down to the Lutheran church here in the Redlands, at the ELCS church, this is where Alan goes down there. They do tinctation. So you don't drink it out of the cup, you just get it on the wafer. So I don't think you have to worry about germs. But I think that's one of the reasons that we went to these multiple cups.
We're lucky we don't use a common cup because we don't have any alcohol in our...
Remember, we're on tape here, Ron.
Yes.
Should we give you your address, telephone number?
Well, we can be, if Luther wants to be crude and irreverent, we can tolerate a little.
Again, just want to emphasize, there's just a lot of stuff going on underneath. But talking about this drain, this foul drain, not just a metaphor, I mean, it's a metaphor, but it's really dissing these guys. So, and when he said, well, that's just their idea. But again, Luther does not discount the importance of the Eucharist because it is one of the sacraments that's critical. But notice what he says, that the sacraments are not fulfilled by being done, but by being what?
Believe.
Believed. And so there's no meritorious something because you're doing this. You benefit from the Mass because you believe. And notice also where we get this idea that we're all equal, priest and layman. So this were a nascent form of priesthood of all believers. Okay, the second sacrament that Luther supports is that of baptism. So could someone read that, the first two paragraphs, that long one, then just that little short one?
To such, even at the present day, baptism is of the highest advantage. If this sacrament had been intended to be given to adults and those of full age, it seems as if it could have hardly preserved its efficacy and its glory in the presence of that tyranny of avarice and superstition which has supplanted all divine ordinances among us. In this case, too, no doubt, fleshly wisdom would have invented its preparations, its worthinesses, its reservations, its restrictions. Now, the sacraments are not fulfilled by being done, but by being believed.
Any comments on that?
Is he defending infant baptism?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, he says it's better that infants are baptized because if it were adults that were baptized, it could be corrupted. But with an infant being baptized, it's not going to be corrupted.
Yeah, but an infant can't believe.
Somebody can believe for them, though.
Oh, well.
We do this in the Adventist Church. We call it dry baptism. Dedication. So we bring children to the front and they're being prayed over. Same concept. In one of my districts as a pastor, the Episcopal minister and I became good friends. And he took me into his church one day and he showed me their baptism. They had a hand carved and all that. And I was being a little snarky. I said, oh, no wonder you baptize babies. That's the only ones you can get in here. So, yeah, we were still being friends after that. Okay, but again, baptism is important. Talking about the tyranny of avarice and superstition, which has supplanted all the divine ordinances. Okay, that next paragraph, which I have highlighted in bold. Can someone read that? Jerry.
I say then, neither pope nor bishop nor any man whatever has the right of making one syllable binding on a Christian man unless it is done with his own consent. Here's a sentence worth pondering. Whatever is done otherwise is done in a spirit of tyranny, and thus the prayers, fastings, almsgiving, and whatever else the Pope ordains and requires in the whole body of his decrees, which are as many as they are iniquitous, he has absolutely no right to require and ordain, and he sins against the liberty of the Church as often as he attempts anything of the kind. Hence it has come to pass that while the churchmen of the present day are strenuous defenders of church liberty, that is, of wood, stone, fields, and money, for in this day things ecclesiastical are synonymous with things spiritual, they yet, by their false teaching, not only bring into bondage the true liberty of the Church, but utterly destroy it. Yea, more than the Turk himself could, contrary to the mind of the apostle who says, "Be not servants of men," we are indeed made servants of men when we are subjected to their tyrannical ordinances and laws.
Pretty strong here, isn't it? Again, the word church. This concept of all these things, the prayers, fastings, almsgiving, and whatever else the Pope ordains and requires is iniquitous. That's a pretty strong word. Iniquitous. Not something that I would use. I'd probably have a hard time pronouncing it several times in a row, but getting pretty strong here in 1520. And remember again, he's written other documents that have made their way to Rome, and now the Pope has sent a bull up to Germany to have Luther tried as a heretic. And so
if they had tried him, if they were able to try him and condemning him as a heretic, would he be executed?
Probably. No?
Yes, usually yes.
Yes.
So he was dependent on the German political power to allow him to even dare to say these things.
Particularly Frederick the Wise, this fellow who sort of was quiet in the presence of everybody else, but arranged for his kidnapping to be taken to the I guess it was Augsburg? What was the name of the palace?
Or yeah.
Yeah, so Frederick the Wise really kept him alive, right?
This is what they did with Jan Hus
Yes.
at Constance in 1415, 17. They accused him of heresy, tried him, and then they burned him at stake.
No, and so this is what I said earlier. I think this is why Luther probably started out with an appeal to the nobility. And is that the one where he talks about how the papacy has destroyed Italy and Germany is next?
Yes.
Is that it?
Yes.
So, it's saying to the Germans, look guys, that guy down there in Rome, he's going to really destroy this place. So you need to get on it. So it wasn't all for spiritual gain that people became Lutherans, or at least the nobility became Lutherans.
So it was a nationalistic movement as well as a spiritual one.
Yeah.
German nationalism enabled Luther to succeed.
Yes.
And the remarkable thing that happened, if we see his evolution from 1517, when he was just protesting against some religious practices of the Catholic Church, in 1520 he evolved in 3 years to the position of a statesman. He was making statements to change the fabric of the German society. Not only the religious life of the Catholic Church, but some of the things that he believed that are not good for the development of Germany, like commerce and
Like what?
like commerce.
Okay.
He believed that Germany is spending too much money importing spices and other things, and also even things that maybe it's a little funny, the brothers, his position about that. And, I mean, he's taking position in this pamphlet against a lot of things that are affecting the German fabric,
Yeah, make Germany great
German
again.
society, not only religious things.
Yeah, now there's much more than religious fervor going on here. This happened a couple of centuries later, but Frederick the Great did not like his soldiers drinking coffee, because coffee was from the Turks, and it wasn't German. You know what Frederick wanted his German soldiers to drink?
Beer?
Beer. Yeah, so, okay. But again, now we're starting to see here again the issue of individual liberty, that we cannot be controlled by Rome. I'm sure that he might even have felt the same way if this had been coming from Vienna. That the problem much stronger because it was Italian. You know, those Italians down there, you know, even in World War II, as I understand it, the reason that the Germans and the Italians got together as allies was just out of convenience, but they didn't like one another. So, again,
Question regarding back to baptism.
yeah.
How does confirmation relate to baptism theologically? How does the church did it? How does Luther conceive of it? If he does at all, I don't.
Confirmation in the sense as you get older, you...
Yes, there's confirmation ceremony or something of the sort.
I don't have a direct answer to that one. My
It's on your
hunch...
page,
Oh, do I have...
Yeah,
Oh, I'm sorry.
this is what he says about that.
Where is that?
I'm lost.
Excuse me, page 4.
Oh, yes, okay, I knew it. Yeah, just a little bit. I do not say this because I condemn the 7 sacraments, but because I deny that they can be proved from the Scripture. I wish there were in the church such a laying on of hands as there was as in the time of the apostles, whether we choose to call it confirmation or healing. So yes, thank you, Dave. He does not believe it's a sacrament. It's something that's important to grow. Not saying that these things aren't important at all, but they're not sacraments. So that would be the distinction that he would make. And it's one of the shorter sections on, in this document. Thank you, David.
So he does not condemn confirmation.
Yeah, no. So it's okay. We're not, I mean, the Lutheran Church today does a lot of these things, but they're not sacraments.
But this is understood as some means of an adult way of confirming the child baptism, sort of, is that?
Probably, as a child, you
And if you're
baptize the child, we dedicate the child, then we will train the child in this. Does that make sense? Oh, Jerry.
So, in my family history files is my mother's confirmation papers, so I've had a chance to think about this. So I think the notion is that what the adolescent, it's a young adolescent usually does, is go through classes and then make a decision to confirm the decision that was made by their parents or others when they were baptized. So that's why we call it confirmation. And then they take their first communion after they're confirmed. And so it's kind of a big celebration. And I think if you think of it in sort of broad cultural terms, most cultures have some way at the point of early adolescence, think of bat mitzvah or bar mitzvah or whatever. I think in the Adventist church, actually baptism is often served about the same function, about the same time. It's like a rite of passage.
So I think, so again, it's important to confirm, but that's not a sacrament. And
So
I
if
think
you-
that distinction, he says there are two sacraments, baptism and the Eucharist. The rest are okay, but we don't have to see them as a means of grace.
You know, one question I'd like to hear anyone here discuss too are, what are the sacraments of the Adventist Church? And do we see them, you're coming to that probably, and do we see them in sacramental terms? I don't know if any of you are familiar with the book by Bernard Eller, just down the street from us, Anabaptist, In Place of Sacraments, where he argues that, I mean, I think he would argue that even Luther has a sort of commissary notion of the church, that it's handing out what amounts to the keys to the kingdom. There are a lot of, you can argue about that, but Luther still has priests, and they still are in charge of communion. Whereas the Anabaptists were much inclined to move away from that. So where are we in that? I don't want to get you sidetracked, but I'd be interested to hear that.
We call them ordinances.
Yeah.
Baptism, marriage, communion.
We call foot washing ordinance.
But I don't know, Jerry, go ahead.
What, I mean, to get straight to the point, I don't know the answer. But in getting to that point, I think it's very, very important for a person who's grown up in Protestantism. I don't know that it's possible to understand the concept of a sacrament. I mean, I don't know exactly, but my sense is a sacrament is something that you either have to do or go through in order to somehow attain some kind of grace. And I don't think as Seventh-day Adventist Protestants we can really even wrap our head around that enough to compare and contrast what we do.
We'd be much more in the Anabaptist tradition there, I think, Jerry. But I can't think of a sacrament that we have, except tithe paying.
Definitely, Eucharist is not considered a sacrament anymore. We are taking here with bottles, opening the juice bottles, and that's not a sacrament.
We may have to delete that out. Hey, by the way, I don't want to hold it, but I want you to know that this is an international ministry now. We had a gentleman here about 3 weeks ago from Australia, of all places. He says, I listen to you every week on YouTube. So he wanted my picture and David's picture all together. So we're international celebrities now. So I try not to let it go to our head. But yeah, no, seriously, we don't take churches seriously as the Roman Catholic Church did in the Middle Ages. Lutherans did at that time. Even Catholics today, I don't think. Any other thoughts? Ordinance of humility, but it's an ordinance. It's a symbol. And we clean our feet before. We never would go there with dirty feet, you know. And ladies, if they're wearing nylons, they can wear their nylons still. You know. Before you couldn't. I take my socks off, but.
Also, baptism for us is generally an affirmation that you accept all of the doctrines of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I know of young people in the last 20 years who wanted to be baptized in the Adventist Church, wanted to become baptized Christians, but wanted it understood that they were not, this was not a symbol that they accepted the Adventist doctrines. And this was done. I suppose if it had been known by the General Conference, it would have been disconfirmed. But yes, I have known of young people raised in Adventist families who were baptized in the Adventist Church as Christians specifically, but not as Seventh-day Adventists.
Yeah.
And even the open communion that is practiced, it's a question mark about it. Because Paul says clearly that if you are taking that and you are not prepared, you are condemned.
Yeah. And that's in earlier part of this, the Babylonian Captivity. It discusses that, about being prepared. Because that was one of the ways that the Catholic Church earned a lot of money, because you could pay certain penance to get prepared to take that. Okay, I want to.
Could I jump in on the sacrament visit?
Sure.
If we go to the one he talks about matrimony, we can see what he means by a sacrament. That is, first of all, the meaning of the word sacrament is that it's a visible appearance of an invisible grace. So the sacrament visibly conveys what is invisibly occurring. But what is the notion here for Luther? What distinguishes a true sacrament from a false sacrament becomes apparent here in the one about matrimony. He says, let us look a little into this. I have said that in every sacrament there is contained a word of promise, which must be believed in him by him who receives the sign, and that the sign alone cannot constitute a sacrament. So for a sacrament to be genuinely so, there has to be a declaration like, this is my body, this is my blood, or you're baptized in the name of the Father, Holy Spirit, and so forth, and a visible, a tangible sin item. There cannot be just the word, and there cannot be just the tangible symbol. It has to both be together, and unless those two are present, Luther will say that may be a very nice thing, like confirmation, very nice, but it's not a sacrament. In order to be a sacrament, it has to have the word of promise and the tangible item, both together. And so the only two that for those reasons, the only two that he sees as legitimate are baptism and the Eucharist. All these others are not necessarily bad, but they're not sacraments.
That's right. And he gets into a lot of detailed discussion in the full document about how the church says certain people can get married, other people can't get married, certain people who are married, now they're not married, they don't get a divorce, they get what? Annulled. So you're married 25 years, you've got 5 kids, you get annulled. What's that make your kids? I mean, well, I won't go into that. But it's just interesting. Eduardo.
I have a thought that when Peter refused to be cleansed, his feet,
Yeah.
Jesus said, if I don't wash your feet, you're not going to have place with me in the kingdom. So this is control. If you don't have the sacrament, you're not going to have place in my kingdom. It's kind of justifiable.
You can understand where the Roman Church tried to make their argument. Luther would say, well, let's not take it that far. Let's look at other things too. So I guess that's how I would see that. But thank you for that point. That's pretty good. Jerry.
That might be worth sticking with for just a minute, because we do have what we call the ordinance of humility.
Yeah.
If you thought of it in real sacramental terms, then we wouldn't do this for each other, but somebody else, I think, would have to do it for us. What's at stake, I think, is not just which words we use. Like we refer to the bread and the wine as emblems, I think, right?
We use ordinance too, don't we?
And we use the word.
Next week we're going to have the ordinance.
Ordinance of humility. But we do that for each other. So we do that for each other.
Yeah.
So what's really at stake, I think, to some extent anyway, in the discussion of sacraments is who brokers the salvation of the church. I mean, who brokers the eternal salvation within the church. And I think that you can see in Luther a move away from, to some extent, the authority, but not of the public. We've read a very strong statement, but not all the way. So you want to move further, then you would go down the street with Zwingli and Gordon Manson, Felix Blaurock, and the Anabaptists, because they have a notion that rather than going to a commissary to get something handed out to you, you're caravanning together on a journey with everybody as equals. I think Adventists are actually kind of a hybrid version of that. I mean, who's allowed to touch the emblems? And how I was taught that my mother was a deaconess. Some of you probably went through this too. Who can make the emblems? Who can destroy them at the end? And so who can touch them? Who can participate in the communion service? Are children allowed to do that? Are they allowed to do that before they're baptized and so forth? These are arguments that go on in Adventism, which to illustrate to me that we're kind of a hybrid, probably. And I think the whole subject of ordination, of who gets to be, in a sense, priestly in the Adventist Church, is one that really illustrates the difference that we have. That's a fairly deep difference in the way we conceptualize church. So that's our sacrament. Ordination.
Yeah.
It fits in the conversation.
Forrest, what I mentioned of the washing of the feet, it also applies to baptism. If you are not baptized,
I don't think Adventists would buy that. We would say, okay, your heart's in the right spot, you're not baptized, you're okay. But prefer to be baptized. There's not some, we don't see something efficacious in the water, you know. Otherwise, I remember one lady I baptized one time, death, by the way, my next life I'll come back as a Presbyterian pastor, where I don't have to immerse. I mean, if anything is going to go wrong, it's going to go wrong at a baptism. I had this one lady that went to baptize, and she was deathly afraid of water, and she went like a board. Bored, I'm serious, bored. And so if you see a lady walking around heaven with part of her face missing, that's she. I mean, I just could not get her face under the water. But we don't see anything wrong with it. We don't see anything efficacious about that water. It's that what goes on in the heart that the person is doing.
Forrest,
What?
is the letter said it.
The letter
The scripture said it. So
needs to be interpreted.
these things confuse many people's minds. So we need to consider that it's not black and white. It's difficult.
Well, I know that when my wife and I got married, the minister who was the minister for church in the counseling said to my wife about her father, her foster father, but she grew up there. You know, your father who come to this church, he helped build this building, came every Sabbath, but he never was baptized. He won't be in the kingdom. Now, that's good counseling to newlyweds or soon to be newlyweds, you know. It's just anyway. One last one here. Oh no, I'll let you can do it because you have the camera. Okay, Peter, go ahead.
Well, quickly, for me, when I'm thinking of the word sacred, sacred is something special. It's something out of the ordinary, has a special meaning. I heard people talking about the communion that for the Jews wasn't just a meal. Well, it was not when Jesus had this before his crucifixion. It was a regular meal, but then at the end of the meal, the way I am reading the gospel, he took the bread and took the wine and instituted this communion. And said that you have to do it, whenever you do it, you do it in remembrance of me. And it was not a regular meal. It has a solemnity in it. It has something special. And we should preserve that.
Just 1 minute, Coach.
Okay. Okay, just want to let me finish up with this one passage. It's on page 3. I don't think we've read it yet, but it's in dark. And that the papacy is in truth nothing else than the kingdom of Babylon. And who is the man of sin and the son of perdition? But he who by his teaching and his ordinances increases the sin and perdition of souls in the church, while he yet sets in the church as if he were God. All these conditions have now for many ages been fulfilled by the papal tyranny. It has extinguished faith, darkened the sacraments, crushed the gospel, while it has enjoined and multiplied without end its own laws. which are not only wicked and sacrilegious, but also unlearned and barbarous.
Wow, what a note on which to end. I'm not sure about you, but I am weary of Luther's tirades. I'm ready to hear Luther preach the gospel. This is pretty negative stuff. If you have a chance to read The Freedom of the Christian between now and next time, even if it's just a few words, this is where Luther really begins to be quite positive in his understanding of the Christian life, and I think you'll find it much more edifying than this. Okay, this afternoon there will be something at the Damaso Theater at 3 o'clock. The Center for the Understanding of World Religions will be presenting something on Hinduism and the Loma University. And then next week we do the Freedom of the Christian, and I think we'll just read through it and see if it takes us anywhere that those who first read it. Forrest asked me if I'd like to mention something about the finances. And I think two things. One is that we're very thankful for the support that this class has provided, and that I think the class would like to be among the possible recipients of your philanthropy this Christmas. There are many, many good things to which to contribute, and I think we would like to be among those that are considered. So I invite you to carefully ponder how you give your charitable dollars. I can think of several things right on campus here that would be also worthwhile. The Center for Christian Bioethics, the Center for Spiritual Life and Wholeness, the Center for Understanding the World Religions, and I think also the Sabbath School class. So ponder where you can make your most satisfying contribution, and we would like to be among those that are considered. Okay, let's do the benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.